road issues in some form or fashion. We're going to toss it back to the anchors for a special report right now.
Chris, thank you. We continue to follow the breaking news surrounding former President Carter's state funeral. The late president's remains arrived in Washington, D.C. today after a snow delay.
Let's join NBC News now for this special report.
In Washington. Any moment now, the caisson carrying Mr. Carter is set to arrive at the east front of the Capitol building. His children and grandchildren are walking behind the caisson in a procession meant to pay tribute to his 1977 inauguration, when he and Mrs. Carter surprised the nation by getting out of their car and walking down the Pennsylvania Avenue route on their way to the White House. Inside the Capitol this afternoon, lawmakers from both parties are gathering to pay tribute to President Carter. Vice President Harris, House Speaker Johnson, and the new Senate Majority Leader John Thune are all expected to speak at a memorial service inside the rotunda before the official lying in state begins this evening. Since Saturday, some 23,000 visitors paid their respects at his presidential library in Atlanta before departing his home state this morning. He left on what was dubbed Special Air Mission 39, a plane normally part of the presidential fleet, but for this mission identified as Air Mission 39. The former president's arrival in Washington today also comes ahead of his casket lying in state at the Capitol building, along with his national funeral later this week. Let's go straight to our senior White House correspondent, Kelly O'Donnell. She's been covering the former president for years. Kelly, good afternoon.
Good afternoon, Lester. What is so striking today is that it tells the story of Jimmy Carter's public life. This return to Washington, of course, honors not only the man, but the office of the presidency. Earlier today, there was a solemn and emotional leaving of the Carter Center. That has been the place that for the many decades of his post-presidency, the work of Jimmy and Rosalind Carter really was embracing their pledge to serve democracy, to try to help global health, all the different initiatives. Back in Washington today, part of what is striking is the temperature, bitterly cold here. And one time when I was talking to President Carter, he reflected on how his own inaugural had been such a cold day. You referenced that he and the family exited the presidential motorcade and walked down the path to the White House. That's reflected in the caisson today. And also the east front of the Capitol, where Jimmy Carter was the last of our modern American presidents to be sworn in on that side of the Capitol. Ronald Reagan chose the west side, the west front as it's known, because it looked toward his home state of California. So today is really about the rituals and the ceremonies of a national mourning. And in some ways, that's in a bit of conflict with who the man was. He was certainly very ambitious for his goals. He was knowledgeable. He was successful. But there was a humility and a simplicity about the life that he led, both inside the White House, where he was known to wear a sweater and to turn down the heat during a period of energy crisis, and also for the work that he did and the life and the way that he lived in his hometown of Plains and the way he engaged in the world in the time since. So that contrast of a man who really embodied a simple existence and yet attained the highest level of power, had enormous influence around the world, not only in office, but for many decades since. Lester?
All right, Kelly, let me go to Ryan Nobles. He's outside on the east front of the Capitol. Ryan, we note this has been an unusual time in Washington on many levels, not to mention the major snowstorm, the certification of the votes yesterday, and now welcoming for one more time a former president to the Capitol.
Yeah, that's right, Lester, and Kelly makes note of just how cold it is out here on the east front. That's indeed true, about 20 degrees. We're seeing whipping wind chills as well, but that has not stopped at all the efforts by the military guard that is out here set up, ready to welcome the president's casket as it makes its way to the east front. All four branches of the U.S. military are represented and spread out along the east front. They were part of the procession that's made its way up Pennsylvania Avenue from the Navy Memorial where the casket was put on that caisson, in the horse-drawn caisson, to be brought here to the East Front before it makes its way up the steps and into the rotunda to lie in state. Now, this is what we're expecting. Once that horse-drawn caisson makes its way to the East Front, there will be a group of what they describe as body bearers. These body bearers represent all different branches of the military. They will take the casket off of the caisson, and then they will march in a very regimented cadence that you'll actually be able to hear the cadence called out, and they'll make their way up those East Front steps, as Kelly rightly points out, where Jimmy Carter was inaugurated as President of the United States back in 1977, before the casket is then brought up into the rotunda, where he will there lie in state until Thursday, when the national funeral will take place. And that will be the opportunity for the public to then come and pay their respects to the former president. There will be the ceremony that you mentioned, Lester, where we'll have members of both the Republican and Democratic parties that will honor the former president's legacy. But then at 7 o'clock tonight, that's when the public will have the opportunity to come through, walk by the casket, and pay their final respects. And they'll have that opportunity until midnight tonight, then all throughout the day on Wednesday, and then part of the day on Thursday as well. So this part of the process of honoring the 39th president of the United States. And you can see, as that horse-drawn caisson makes its way here now to the East Front of the Capitol, the family members from the Carter family trailing behind the casket, much like the former president, as he broke with tradition and got out of the motorcade and walked from Pennsylvania Avenue from the Capitol to the White House when he was inaugurated. Of course, now making the reverse trip back here to the Capitol, his final days here in Washington, his last trip to Washington, D.C., the former president of the United States, Jimmy Carter. Lester.
All right, Ryan, thanks. Let me go to Hallie Jackson, our senior Washington correspondent. Hallie, taking this all in, what are your thoughts?
Looking at these images here, Lester, it is a moment like this when you think about not just the person who is being honored and remembered, and former President Jimmy Carter, but the way that at this moment you have Washington in many ways coming to a stop for this moment, for the one that we will see on Thursday, the national funeral service there for former President Carter. We will see at that time former President Trump, for example, who has said he will attend, in the same room as President Biden, of course, the man he defeated may have defeated in this most recent election, of course, up against Kamala Harris there, but one of his political rivals, in the same room, in the same place. Even as you see at the Capitol here, members of both parties here, the incoming Senate leader, the former House Speaker, a Democrat, top Republican, coming together here to honor somebody who had a somewhat turbulent political career in the White House, somebody who ended his time not popular with the American public, but who worked so hard after leaving the presidency to bring people together, to work on his humanitarian efforts, to instill tenets of democracy among those around the world. It has long been said that he may be a more popular ex-president than president. I think there are some historians who would take exception to that, some Carter experts who say he did so much even while in office that his legacy should be remembered in that way as well. But this is a moment where Washington comes together here, and we're going to see that throughout the course of this week, even on this frigid day here in D.C. Remember, too, Jimmy Carter was a man of deep faith. This is somebody who continued to teach Sunday school in Plains, Georgia, well into the latter part of his life here. Somebody who held close to those religious philosophies. He described himself as born again throughout the course of his career, and that informed not just his political thinking, although he did emphasize and talk about the importance of the separation of church and state, but so much of his personal thinking as well, Lester.
And we see the procession now nearing the east steps of the Capitol. Ryan Nobles is there in sight. What can you see?
Yeah, so at this point, the horses have stopped, and the caisson has stopped as well. We see the members of the honor guard beginning their preparations to move to the caisson to begin the process of taking that casket off the caisson and then making their way up the East Front steps. There are representatives from the Joint Chiefs of Staff as well that are standing at the base of the east front of the steps to also pay their respects as well. And it is pretty a remarkable sight here, Lester, to see all four branches of the U.S. military in their honor regalia, standing right now in honor of this former president and the impact that he had on the United States. He, of course, a graduate of the Naval Academy, a former naval lieutenant, which is part of the reason that this procession began at the Naval Memorial down Pennsylvania Avenue. We do expect to hear from the Vice President, Kamala Harris, who is going to give remarks inside the rotunda once the casket makes its way into the rotunda to lie in state. And then we'll also hear from Republicans as well. As Hallie rightly points out, it's a time of polarized politics here in Washington, but we're going to hear from the new majority leader in the United States Senate, Senator John Thune of South Dakota. We're also going to hear from the House Speaker, Mike Johnson, as well, who will also speak about Carter's legacy and the impact that they feel that he had on the United States during his time as president of the United States. And, you know, so much has been made of the former president's activities after he left the White House. And I would imagine that's what you'll hear, particularly the Republicans focus on, the work he did with Habitat for Humanity and building houses for the less advantaged all throughout not just the United States, but the world. And now we see the case in moving yet again, Lester, as they prepare the process of taking the casket up those east front steps. And just for context, for those who've not been here to Washington and been here to the Capitol, these east front steps are rarely used. That the door to the rotunda there is not open to the public on a daily basis. This is not a point of egress for even members of Congress. They do go up the steps outside the House and Senate chambers, but largely the east front steps are not utilized. It's only special occasions like these where you see that big massive door that leads to the rotunda open and where you see any sort of activity. And just to keep in mind, when you see these body bearers that will represent all four branches of the United States military walking up these steps in a very rigid cadence, that is a steep incline that they're going to be going up on a very frigid day. And so this is not any sort of easy responsibility that they have here in bringing up the former president's casket and his body on such a reverent day. So it's definitely going to be a challenge. You could tell, Lester, by the way that those flags are moving right now, just how intense the wind is right now on the east front of the Capitol. And this east front is often sort of a wind tunnel where the wind just whips through this area. And we're definitely experiencing that right now as it is very cold. And so this will definitely be a challenge for these body bearers. But my guess is that it will not seem like a challenge as you're watching at home, but it definitely will be, Lester.
We expect, Ryan, the 21-gun salute to occur here in a moment. And we should note the plans for the final farewell to President Carter have been laid out literally for years, but it is a breathing document and has made allowances and changes dictated by the weather on this cold January day and the day leading up to this. So they have remarkably found a new schedule and pretty much stayed on it. The family in positions right now, honor guards in place right now. Kelly O'Donnell, as we watch this, we are about to hear, as I said, the 21-gun salute.
And Jimmy Carter himself designed these events, and he chose some of these important details, like going to the Navy Memorial, which he signed into law and authorized its existence back in 1980, and having his family with him, 3 sons, his daughter Amy, who was certainly very prominent during his time in the White House as a little girl who attended public school in Washington, D.C. Each of the details that unfolds, from selecting the music to choosing among many different rituals that were options for him, he would revise it and change it over time. And in part, that's why we will see the sons of some of his contemporaries participate in the next few days, because Jimmy Carter, at age 100, outlived so many of his contemporaries. But this is a ceremony that reflects him, reflects his service to the country as a graduate of the Naval Academy, the only U.S. president who did so. He was of the generation of World War II as a midshipman, and then later served in Korea. And of course, his time in office was 4 years. Once I spoke to Rosalind Carter about that notion of him being so popular as a past president, and she rejected it quickly and said, no, 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 he was a very fine president, and that history will record him as such. And there are many parts of our life today that he had a hand in, by putting in policies, by having views that were perhaps ahead of his time, like solar panels on the top of the White House, and things like creating the inspector general role in government, where citizens can have accountability of their government. So important after the Watergate years and the loss of trust. The first president to release publicly his taxes, followed by all of them except for Donald Trump. Those kinds of small aspects of his presidency do sort of tie a thread to the modern moment we're in now. He and Donald Trump spoke by phone at times. President Carter also told me once that it was George H.W. Bush who had been the most consistent in checking in with him as a former president, because Jimmy Carter, leaving office in his 50s, was known to be outspoken about contemporary politics in his time, and that often was at odds with the current president of the day. And his criticisms sometimes were viewed to be outside the sort of the club of former presidents. He did view himself as an outlier and a truth teller, and at the same time also very much wanted to have that connection. And he told me how much it mattered to him that George Herbert Walker Bush would call him and consult with him and keep him in the loop on matters of the day. So all of those sort of reflections of Jimmy Carter tell what was a complex story of a man who loved Southern rock and roll and did so much for his hometown of Plains, still to this day with charitable work that helps the citizens of Plains, and being honored in this way with all of the ceremony at the highest point of our government, to have really Washington pause for him for this period of days.
Yeah, and Kelly, you know so well that the Capitol can often be a symbol of the divisions in this country and things that are perceived going the wrong way. But yet we can find these moments like this where lawmakers on both sides of the aisle can pay their respect to a former president of either party.
And institutions are not always popular, but it's moments like this where tradition stands, where people see the thread of time from a presidency that was decades ago to a moment today where there's a whole different set of political issues, and yet they are not all that different at their core. And so seeing Republicans and Democrats together, seeing members of the military, we'll see members of the Supreme Court, dignitaries of many types who will show their respect, again, for the office as well as the man. And that is important as the country is on the other side of the Capitol. There is already erected a lot of the staging that will be used for the next inaugural in just a couple of weeks' time. And so in many ways, the East Front, where Jimmy Carter chose to have this service today because he was inaugurated there, has its day-to-day appearance, whereas on the other side of the Capitol, you already see the many preparations for this January 20th.
And you mentioned these preparations and the presidents are questioned as to what they want. Does that process start at the moment they leave office, or virtually at the moment?
They are made aware by the Military District of Washington when they're in office about how that will happen, and initial planning begins, and choices can be made of an array of music and the symbolism and things like choosing to use the caisson, which he selected, choosing the route, choosing the method of how he would be moved from his home state back to Washington and so forth. He was very clear saying he did not want the train ride home, so he will be on the presidential presidential aircraft, which is designated as Special Air Mission 39. He, of course, the 39th president. So it looks like Air Force One, but it only has that designation when the sitting president is on board. So Special Air Mission 39 brought Mr. Carter to Washington. It will take him home to Plains on Thursday, where there will be a family and community funeral, private service, and then internment on his home yard, in effect. He's already deeded that to the National Park Service. So the home that he has shared with Rosalind Carter, their 77-year marriage, they lived there since the 1960s, and that home is now part of the National Park Service and will be an ongoing monument where the public will be able to go and see Mrs. Carter and President Carter interred there. That will happen on Thursday. Over these next couple of days, it is the Washington portion where the American public can come through at the Capitol and pay their respects, and where leaders will be able to pay their respects. And certainly as the years went by for Jimmy Carter, he would review the plan and make adjustments to it. And certainly they allowed for adjustments, like he died before the holiday, and allowing some additional time for that, allowing some time for the important ceremony of January 6th to certify the election results. So there was some flexibility in it, but there's always multiple days that allow the country in both personal ways, biographical ways, and then ways that tie all presidents together in this. Hail to the Chief, by the way, is only played for the sitting president and at the time of a president's funeral. So you will hear Hail to the Chief, but that is only done for the sitting president and when we say goodbye to a president.
Let me bring back Ryan Nobles right now. Ryan, okay, we're going to go to Jonathan Alter first. Jonathan Alter is a NBC News contributor. He's the author of a book about Jimmy Carter. We've heard a lot of tributes over the last several days, Jonathan. Which thought perhaps sums up his life best?
So, Lester, I think it might be something that Jason Carter, Jimmy Carter's grandson, who chairs the board of the Carter Center, that he said the other day at the Carter Center. He said that somebody told him, it's amazing how much you can cram into 100 years. This was an epic American life that went way beyond his 12 years in 4 in the Georgia State Senate, 4 as governor of Georgia, 4 as president. So his public service extended over many decades, and I think provides a kind of inspiration for us in charting our way forward and making sure that we all understand that whatever the politics of the day, we are fundamentally a decent people, and that we can get back that sense of decency. And I think that is a partial explanation for this quite astonishing outpouring of respect and even love for Jimmy Carter, because he represented a life that was ambitious not just for himself, but to better the lives of people all over the world.
How is his, you've been in contact with family members, how do they approach this moment? Certainly we knew for many months now that his time was near.
Well, I think, it's always hard when you lose a parent, and it's just been a little bit more than a year since Rosalind Carter died. So they lost 2 parents in short order. Obviously, they were prepared for it, but I think they are appreciative that the Jimmy Carter that they knew and loved and understood is now being seen that way by millions of other people all over the world. And so I think even they, from what I understand, have been really surprised at the level of the outpouring. There are African children named after Jimmy Carter. This is a man who was born in Jim Crow segregation, Jim Crow South, barefoot as a young boy, no electricity, no running water, and he went from those origins to becoming a global humanitarian icon. So I think that they're increasingly understanding that their father had a classic American story, and that it was a complex story full of plenty of setbacks, and he certainly had his shortcomings, and he obviously was a political failure. He lost to Ronald Reagan in 1980 by a large margin, but he was also a visionary, particularly in the area of energy and the environment and on foreign policy, where he was responsible for the Camp David Accords, the most enduring peace treaty since the end of World War II.
I know
these are big accomplishments.
I know there's really no answer to this question, but I'll ask it anyway. In this political environment, could a man like that succeed?
That's an open question, Lester, but I wouldn't say no, because, one of the questions that we're all facing as we approach the beginning of a new administration is Donald Trump in the American grain? Is this who we are? And I think the answer to that has to be maybe not. That, we are a people that can have many different qualities at once. And I think ultimately we are an idealistic, decent people, and that somebody who came along and appealed to what Lincoln called the better angels of our nature could have a shot again in politics. Obviously, maybe not for a while, but remember, Carter was elected in 1976 in the wake of Vietnam and Watergate, when our lack of faith in our institutions, our cynicism, our bitterness were about what they are now. And yet he appealed to what he called a government as good as its people, to say that actually, no, a lot's gone wrong in the 1960s and 70s, but we can come back. And democracy has always been about renewal. It's always been about finding new ways of facing the future with an open mind and an open heart. And I think Carter, in that sense, is a very American figure. And there are others like him out there, maybe inspired by his example, who are young now, but thinking maybe I can do something beyond just making money and make a contribution in other ways, whether in public service in the government or in my own community. Jimmy and Rosalind Carter were very active in the Plains community until their mid-90s. They were doing all kinds of things. And at their church, Jimmy Carter cut the grass and Rosalind vacuumed the sanctuary. They were all about doing things not just for themselves, both of them plenty ambitious, but also ambitious to do something for other people.
And you had
that's
the feeling
a pretty good lesson.
And you had the feeling that it was never for the photo op, that it was who they were as people.
So for a long time, people thought it was for the photo op, even after he became president. Like, he'd carry his own bags, and they'd say, oh, the bags are empty, this is all just a show, But as time went on, people realized it was genuine. He was a genuinely modest person. And when he challenged Americans to sacrifice and be less materialistic, that came from his religious conviction. It wasn't something that he was doing to get votes. And he consistently, and to his own detriment, made decisions that hurt him politically, but that he thought were right. Sometimes he'd act political, but much of the time he would do things, for instance, turning over the Panama Canal, which is now very controversial, which he thought was necessary to prevent a war. This was something that he knew was unpopular, but that needed to be done. It's interesting watching the riderless horse here, this tremendous symbol of these moments of public mourning that we have in this country. My understanding is the saddle is put backwards because it's for the dead commander to be able to look back on the troops behind him so that he can have one last look at those he inspired. And in that sense, it's a beautiful symbol.
We are looking at the remains of former President Carter as we look at the caisson. We saw the family moving in a moment ago, and we expect shortly the 39th president to be carried up the stairs into the east front of the Capitol. There will be a brief service, eulogies will be offered, and then later the doors will open for members of the public to pay their respects as President Carter will lie in state. Let's go back to Hallie Jackson right now. Hallie, again, a significant, after a very significant day at the Capitol yesterday, a different tone here, but just as weighty.
I'm struck by that too, Lester, as we look there at the steps of the east front of the Capitol, considering what we've seen over the course of the last maybe 36 hours and what we saw 4 years ago right around the same time period. Remember that these are the steps where we saw that attack on the Capitol on January 6th in 2021. Yesterday, obviously, a very different scene. The peaceful transfer of power went off as it typically does without any kind of surprise or drama. And now today, this moment at the same location, as you saw those family members there, as you see the beginning of the processional now up the steps. And you have to remember, as I listened to you and Jonathan talk and you and Kelly about how significant Jimmy Carter's presidency and post-presidency was, you also have these family members mourning the loss of a father, of a grandfather, of Jimmy Carter the man versus Jimmy Carter the political figure. He is a man of many facets, and they're all being remembered here today.
Remarkable scene, as we said, a cold day. It's 4:46 in the afternoon in Washington, D.C. as we await the former president to be taken up the stairs into the East Front. Kelly O'Donnell watching along with us as well. Kelly.
Well, I'm struck also about that personal side of the family of Jimmy Carter, his son Jack, his son Jeff, Chip, who is James Earl Carter III, daughter Amy, their children, an extended family. A life that spans 100 years certainly has a broad family. And his sons were very much a part of spending time at the White House, lived in the White House for part of that, even though they were young adults. The changes that were brought by the Carter administration and service, he created the Departments of Energy and Education that are just very much a part of our daily life now. That's something that he had a sense that there needed to be a federal level of supporting education, which is so broadly handled at the state and local level, and obviously his belief in conserving energy and conservation and ecology and environment and all of those things that were in some ways new terms at the time that have become very much a part of a global mindset of concern about the planet. For family members, there you see Chip and probably his wife as well, and members of the family who will receive the casket as it comes up the stairs. All of this is something that is in some ways different than their lives. They don't live public lives. As presidential families, they have very much private lives, but they are able to tap into this and recognize the importance of this ceremony for the country and as a source of pride of the man that they loved and knew as a father. Chip talked movingly about having trouble with Latin in school and how his father took his textbook, studied it for hours himself, and then tutored his son in Latin, leading to a good score. That kind of personal involvement in his children's lives is something that they hold those stories dear, and we're lucky enough to hear some of them during times of mourning like this. In Plains, I've spoken to so many of his friends and neighbors who would share a meal with him, who would see him and Mrs. Carter, Rosalind Carter, at the local market or visiting with neighbors, very much living among them. An author with more than 30 books to his name. That was part of how he financed his career when the peanut farm that he inherited ultimately did not succeed and was sold. He came out of the office of president in debt and used his ability to write as a way to fortify the family's finances. So different than the kind of post-presidency we see today, where our presidents leave office and are often greatly enriched by opportunities. That was not the choice that he made. He lived a simple life, but he also respected these kinds of rituals, and that's why he authorized, even though he was personally uncomfortable with some of the pomp and the ceremony, he knew it was important.
We hear some of the commands being uttered by the honor guards here who will take the former president. Ryan Nobles has been watching from the East Front as well. Ryan, give us a sense of the moment.
You know, Lester, I think what's most remarkable about the military body bearers that are responsible for making that procession up the East Front steps is just how precise they are in each step that they take on that march, but then also the effort that they make to make sure that the casket is completely parallel as they're moving up the steps, that it is not in any way tilted or leaning down as they make their way up what is a very steep incline on the East Front. And it's remarkable to watch on television. It's even more remarkable to watch in person, especially given the conditions that they're dealing with. As they were going up the steps, a massive gust of wind came through. Had to have been at least between 15 and 20 miles an hour. That just had to make that process even more difficult. But you could not even tell in any way, shape, or form that it seemed to bother them as they really held to their duty and made sure that they executed that responsibility with precision, and that's exactly what happened. Now that the casket is now inside the rotunda, they'll begin this remembrance ceremony that will take place in the rotunda. It's a bipartisan ceremony. We'll first hear from the Senate chaplain, Barry Black. You see John Barrasso, who's a member of the Republican leadership there, with Elizabeth Warren, who's, of course, a Democratic member of the United States Senate. And after we hear from Chaplain Black, you'll hear from the Senate Majority Leader, John Thune, who recently took that job last week on Friday when the Republicans took back control of the majority of the Senate. And then we'll hear from the House Speaker, Mike Johnson, as well, and then from the Vice President, Kamala Harris, who will deliver a eulogy in honor of Jimmy Carter. It's interesting, he's in the rotunda. Lester, we know that he was a fan of Harry Truman, the former president. There's, of course, a statue in honor of Harry Truman inside the rotunda. That is a very special spot for a former president to be given in honor in the rotunda, and Harry Truman is among the group of former presidents that has a statue in his honor in the rotunda. Another president who played an important role in Jimmy Carter's history is, of course, Gerald Ford, who he beat in that election in 1976 to win the presidency. He and Ford, of course, were political rivals who then eventually became friends. And we are told to expect a nod to the role that Gerald Ford played in Jimmy Carter's life as well as part of this remembrance ceremony that's about to take place in the rotunda. But obviously a very solemn and impressive event that we saw play out here on a very frigid day in Washington, D.C. on the East Front of the United States Capitol, Lester.
And Ryan, tell me again when the public will be allowed to pay respects.
So that will begin tonight at 8 o'clock. Originally, it was at 7 o'clock, but everything got pushed back about an hour and a half because of the weather here in Washington, D.C. But the public can begin that process at 8 o'clock tonight and then through midnight tonight. And then they'll have all day on Wednesday as well to have the opportunity to pass by the casket and pay their respects to the former president.
And a lot of familiar faces as the camera slowly pans up high, showing this place where, and there's Vice President Harris. And there will be this brief eulogy, a brief service here in just a moment. We will hear the Vice President speak along with the House and Senate leaders. It's the top of the hour now, 5 p.m. in the East and on Capitol Hill, where the funeral service for former President Jimmy Carter is about to begin inside the Capitol Rotunda. Soon we'll hear eulogies from the new Senate Majority Leader, Republican John Thune, along with House Speaker Mike Johnson and, as we noted, Vice President Kamala Harris. And later this evening, Mr. Carter's body will lie in state at the Capitol. Thousands of people expected to line up to pay their final respects, all ahead of his national funeral later this week. Let me bring back Ryan Nobles. Ryan, this is played out over a number of days here, but obviously the planning for all this has been years in the making.
Yeah, that's right, Lester, and the former president himself played a hand in that. As many as 15 years ago, the planning process began for this final remembrance of his time and service to the United States. He obviously lived to be 100 years old, so there was quite a bit of time for them to prepare for this. He'd been in hospice care for more than a year, so even the close preparations up until this day, obviously this was anticipated for quite some time. So the amount of painstaking effort made to make sure that every aspect of this final days of remembrance for the president went off without a hitch were definitely, there was a lot of work and effort put into it, and a lot of work and effort that the former president himself played an important role in. And I think one of the things that's been very notable, and I think kind of a hallmark of his life, was the very visible and important presence that his family has played throughout this. That's part of the reason that we saw a bit of a delay here, was because there were so many of his family members that were there behind the horse-drawn caisson as they were making their way up Pennsylvania Avenue. And then here at the Capitol as well, there were a group of his family members that were at the base of the East Steps that followed the casket up into the rotunda. But then there was another group, a large group of family members that had to make their way through the Capitol on the inside to get to the top of the steps to receive the casket as the casket made its way up those steps. So his family played such an important role in his life before he got into politics, after he was out of politics, the remarkable work he did as a former president, and it's not a surprise to see the important role that they're playing here today in his final remembrance. Here we see, Lester, all the members of the congressional leadership, Hakeem Jeffries, who's of course the House Minority Leader, the Democrat from New York, Chuck Schumer, who's now the Senate Minority Leader, next to him. And then you see, of course, John Thune, the Majority Leader. This is the House and Senate Sergeant in Arms, who are responsible for the security of the Capitol, leading the procession as the casket makes its way into the rotunda.
And we'll watch this moment.
Whose arms have bound the restless waves. We thank you for the inspiration of a consequential and laudable life as we celebrate the legacy of James Earl Carter, Jr., the 39th President of the United States. We proclaim your generosity to this nation and world for giving us the gift of someone with the ethical congruence to be salt and light to his generation. Lord, he made the world more palatable. We thank you for his passion for integrity, his commitment to lead the world better than he found it, and his exemplary love for his precious Rosalind. Inspired by his great life, teach us to know you more clearly, to love you more dearly, and to follow you more nearly each day. We pray in your matchless name. Amen.
Madam Vice President, Mr. Speaker, Leader Schumer, Leader Jeffries, Jack, Chip, Jeff, Amy, and other members of the Carter family, and distinguished guests. Today we gather to begin a final farewell to Jimmy Carter, Navy veteran, peanut farmer, Governor of Georgia, and President of the United States. Sunday school teacher, Nobel Prize winner, advocate for peace and human rights, and first and foremost, a faithful servant of his Creator and his fellow man. In a commencement speech he delivered at Liberty University back in 2018, President Carter told a story about going on a mission to Massachusetts back in his younger days under the auspices of the Southern Baptist Convention. During that trip, President Carter was impressed by the success of a fellow missionary in winning souls to Christ. And so as the mission was winding down, he asked him what made him so successful. He was a little embarrassed by my question, President Carter recalled, but then he finally said, I try to have two loves in my heart. One love is for God, and the other love I have in my heart is for the person who happens to be in front of me at any particular time. It was a statement, President Carter said, that he never forgot. And I think it's fair to say that it's also a statement he lived by. President Carter's term as president ended in 1981. And for the remainder of his life, the longest post-presidency of any American president ever, he focused on making the lives of his fellow men better. That meant things like the Carter Center, which, among other things, works for the eradication of disease in some of the poorest areas of the globe. And it meant things like his work with Habitat for Humanity to provide affordable housing for those in need. And when I say his work with Habitat for Humanity, I do mean his work. Jimmy Carter knew that his status as a former president could bring attention to good causes. It's why he encouraged Habitat to make use of his name and image. But simply lending his name, or maybe attending a gala or two, wasn't Jimmy Carter's style. He was here to get down in the weeds and the dirt. And he did that literally on numerous Habitat builds, including one back in 1994 in Eagle Butte in my home state of South Dakota. Well into his 90s, he could be found with his hard hat and tools on construction sites doing the practical work required to get families into homes. The Son of Man did not come to be served, but to serve. And Jimmy Carter did his very best to live according to the calling of his Lord and Savior. Today I join all Americans in mourning President Carter and remembering his example. But I rejoice in the thought that he, together with his beloved wife, Rosalind, is now before the face of his Father.
To the family, to Jack and Chip and Jeff and Amy, the entire Carter family, Vice President Harris, members of the Cabinet, Leader Thune, my colleagues in Congress, and my fellow citizens. We meet in this sacred hall of self-government to honor an extraordinary man, a man who modeled the virtues of service and citizenship as well as any other American. Surrounding us are the statues of those who gave their time, their energy, and their lives for the good of America. Before us lays a man who now joins their midst as a patriot, a veteran, a humanitarian, and the 39th President of the United States. When Jimmy Carter walked out on the east front of the Capitol and took his oath of office, I was just 4 years old, and he's the first president that I remember. Looking back, it's obvious now to me as an adult why he captured everyone's attention. Jimmy Carter was a member of the greatest generation. He lived through the Great Depression. He did that on a farm in rural Georgia. He knew the value of a dollar, and he modeled thrift his entire life. As long as he was in office, he hated government waste. His father, an Army veteran of the World War I era, taught patriotism to his children. And eventually his son, this young man from Plains, followed his father's example of self-sacrifice, and he joined the Naval Academy in the middle of World War II. In the Army, Lieutenant Carter learned from the legendary Admiral Rickover to always do his best as he served on the first fleet of nuclear submarines. It's telling that today the USS Jimmy Carter, a top-secret attack submarine, now roams the oceans bearing the name of the only president who served in such close quarters. President Carter's life, his selfless service, his fight against cancer, and his lasting contributions to his fellow man are all truly remarkable. Whether he was in the White House or in his post-presidential years, as was discussed, President Carter was willing to roll up his own sleeves to serve and get the job done. We all know about his work with Habitat for Humanity, and that was mentioned. And the origin story goes that it was in 1984, when he first became aware of the work. He was in New York for a friend's anniversary. Millard Fuller, the founder of the fledgling charity at the time, called President Carter and asked if he wanted to visit a site in Brooklyn during his trip. President Carter agreed, and he found his way down to the Lower East Side. Standing on the roof of a dilapidated building, he looked out on the wealth of Wall Street to the south and to the power of Midtown Manhattan to the north. And then he looked down and he saw an image he'd never forget. An elderly woman cooking breakfast over an open fire in the rubble of the building, there in the heart of the richest city in the world. The Habitat for Humanity worker that was there with him turned to President Carter and said, if there's anything that you can do, we would take it. He said, if there's anything I can do, let me know. The worker said, well, maybe you can send some volunteer carpenters from your church. It was the very next day that President Carter called Habitat for Humanity and told them he was going to send some carpenters, all right, and that he himself would be one of them. And thus began his famous tradition of donating 1 week every year to build and restore homes for his fellow Americans. It's remarkable to think that one of the 45 men who has served as president, and one of the only 13 who held the role in the nuclear age, would humble himself to such service. We all know that his care for humanity didn't stop at building homes. In the face of illness, President Jimmy Carter brought life-saving medicine. In the face of conflict, he brokered peace. In the face of discrimination, he reminded us that we are all made in the image of God. And if you were to ask him why he did it all, he would likely point to his faith. I'm reminded of his admonition to, quote, live our lives as though Christ were coming this afternoon, and of his amazing personal reflection. Quote, if I have one life and one chance to make it count for something. We all agree that he certainly did. So today in these hallowed halls of our republic, we honor President Carter, his family, and his enduring legacy that he leaves, not only upon this nation, but upon the world.
Leader Thune, Speaker Johnson, Leader Schumer, Leader Jeffries, members of Congress, and distinguished guests. It is an honor to be with you this afternoon, and to Jack, Chip, Jeff, Amy, and Jason, and all the other members of the Carter family. On behalf of the American people, Doug and I offer our deepest condolences. Being with you today, I'm reminded of the enduring words of a favorite hymn. May the works I have done speak for me. Today we gather to celebrate the life of a man whose works will echo for generations to come. A man from Plains, Georgia, who grew up without electricity or running water, and served as the 39th President of the United States of America, and lived every day of his long life in service to the people. President James Earl Carter, Jr. So I was in middle school when Jimmy Carter was elected president, and I vividly recall how my mother admired him, how much she admired his strength of character, his honesty, his integrity, his work ethic and determination, his intelligence, and his generosity of spirit. We have heard much today and in recent days about President Carter's impact in the 4 decades after he left the White House. Rightly so. Jimmy Carter established a new model for what it means to be a former president, and leaves an extraordinary post-presidential legacy. From founding the Carter Center, which has helped advance global human rights and alleviate human suffering, to his public health work in Latin America and Africa, to his tireless advocacy for peace and democracy around the globe. And Jimmy Carter was the President of the United States who was ahead of his time. He was the first President of the United States to have a comprehensive energy policy, including providing some of the first federal support for clean energy. He also passed over a dozen major pieces of legislation regarding environmental protection. and more than doubled the size of America's national parks, including protecting our beloved redwoods in my home state of California. He was a president who, between the years of 1977 and 1981, appointed more Black Americans to the federal bench than all of his predecessors combined, and appointed 5 times as many women. And in the wake of Watergate, Jimmy Carter passed historic ethics legislation to help rebuild America's faith in government. Jimmy Carter, as president, was also a respected global leader. To be sure, the years of his presidency were not without international crises or challenges, but his legacy of global leadership is well established. In Asia, he instituted full diplomatic relations with China, which he would later call one of the most historically significant accomplishments of his presidency. And his legacy lives on in the Middle East because, do recall, in the decades before Jimmy Carter became president, Israel and Egypt had been at war numerous times. Few thought peace could be achieved between them. Yet Jimmy Carter did that. Through his persistence and perseverance, through his unshakable belief in the power of American diplomacy, he secured the Camp David Accords, one of the most significant and durable peace treaties since World War II. And throughout the world, Jimmy Carter elevated the role of human rights in America's foreign policy priorities and uplifted the importance of civil society in doing that work. Jimmy Carter was a forward-looking president with a vision for the future. Consider his establishment of the Department of Energy in 1977, which anticipated the central role it would play in addressing the climate crisis. His creation of FEMA in 1979, which enabled our nation to mobilize a national response to disasters, which has helped countless communities rebuild and recover. And his founding of the Department of Education later that year, which elevated public education institutions and increased national standards for the education of America's children and future leaders. Jimmy Carter was that all too rare example of a gifted man who also walks with humility, modesty, and grace. Recall the stories from the 1976 campaign about how he slept in the homes of his supporters to share a meal with them at their table and to listen to what was on their minds. How on their first trip for Habitat for Humanity, Jimmy and Rosalind rode the bus with the other volunteers. And when the group stopped for the night to stay at a local church, Jimmy and Rosalind gave their private room to a young couple who had put off their honeymoon to join the trip. And with the other volunteers, they then slept on the floor of the church basement. And then, of course, his work to eradicate the vicious guinea worm disease that once disabled millions of people a year. It was one of the Carter Center's greatest triumphs. And Jimmy Carter, of course, given his nature, attributed its success not to his own leadership, but to the thousands of everyday Africans who were on the ground doing the work. Throughout his life and career, Jimmy Carter retained a fundamental decency and humility. James Earl Carter Jr. loved our country. He lived his faith, he served the people, and he left the world better than he found it. And in the end, Jimmy Carter's work and those works speak for him, louder than any tribute we can offer. May his life be a lesson for the ages and a beacon for the future. May God bless President Jimmy Carter, and may God bless the United States of America.
Vice President Harris, we have been listening to tributes to former President Jimmy Carter inside the Capitol Rotunda in Washington. Vice President Harris finishing up her eulogy, remembering Mr. Carter as someone who lived every day of his life in service to the public. We also heard eulogies from the top Republicans in Congress, Senate Majority Leader John Thune and House Speaker Mike Johnson as well. This evening, former President Carter will lie in state inside the Capitol, where thousands are expected to pay their final respects. That concludes our coverage. We'll see you a little later on with more tonight on NBC Nightly News. I'm Lester Holt. Good day.